where you scream to watch that, watch this, and I'll dive down through this hairy flesh.
Hi, and welcome to Watch This. I'm CJ Johnson. Welcome to our fresh vibe. We've got new chairs, we've got a new table, and if you're watching this via the filmmafia.com.au website, you'll notice a fresh vibe there as well. We're looking at Blade Runner 2049. Jim Flanagan has joined me for an in-depth discussion. We'll look at the history of the film, we'll discuss our general thoughts, and then we will get into a spoiler section. We'll let you know before we're getting into that, so you can stop watching if you haven't seen the film yet. But the fact is, we are going to, at least for some of this episode, spoil the film, or at least discuss the film as though either you've watched it, or you don't intend to watch it, or you just don't care about spoilers. So welcome and enjoy our discussion on Blade Runner 2049.
There is an order to things.
That's what we do here. We keep order.
The world is built on a wall that separates kind. Tell either side there's no wall, you bought a war.
Jim Flanagan.
CJ,
welcome.
how are you?
So let's just have a little history. You've got a little history of how this came to be.
Yeah, and I just think there's so much to talk about in this film. It's kind of good it's kind of good to hit the pause button and look at the backstory of the original, and I think Denis Villeneuve's career as well, because these are two huge directors, I think, involved in this film and the kind of history of this film. And I don't know about you, you and I have talked previously about Denis Villeneuve. I've always had some problems with him as a filmmaker. I've always enjoyed his films. I've always thought he was a really fantastic cinematic technician, but that his films just often lack substance and a bit of heart. And interestingly, I think, considering this film, and it's effectively a sequel to the Ridley Scott original Blade Runner, which is one of my absolute favourite films of all time, and I think right up there in kind of science fiction film history. And I think it's interesting that in a lot of ways Villeneuve is sort of talked about as the new Ridley Scott, inclusive of some of the issues that Ridley Scott has and limitations potentially that has as a director, and that he's considered one of the great visual stylists of cinema, but that his latter films, not including Blade Runner, which I think is rightly seen as a classic, often suffer the same criticisms that are levelled at Villeneuve, in that he's this magnificent technician who often makes films of not a huge amount of substance, potentially. So I was fascinated as soon as this was greenlit. And interestingly enough, Ridley Scott was originally lined up to direct this, but he went off to direct his kind of crap Alien prequels, depending on how you like those films. And so Villeneuve was lined up. So I was immediately fascinated at the choice of director a few years ago.
Villeneuve, for me, none of his films have wholly satisfied me yet.
I agree.
Something like Arrival, I loved much of it. I loved, for example, its world, its script, its idea, its central conceit, its lead character. But then I hated the whole emotional sob story, sentimental subplot enough that it offset that film. And each of his films has had something for me that has offset my total enjoyment. He's yet for me to make a complete film, even though for me he's obviously someone who can make movies. I mean, that is self-apparent. He knows what to do with visuals and sound, like Ridley Scott. I mean, he knows on an incredibly high level.
Well, I was going to say,
story is his problem.
He doesn't just know. I mean, I think he's one of the great technicians in contemporary cinema. And I didn't have as many issues as you did with some of the content of Arrival. I enjoyed it, but very similarly to Sicario, which I also really, really enjoyed, I just found it a bit empty. Once you got past the meticulously, majestically constructed Roger Deakins cinematography, who also shoots this film, and the Johan Johansson score, and we can talk about him and his early involvement in this film before he was turfed. But yeah, so I completely agree with you. I've never fully been satisfied with Villeneuve as a filmmaker either. So I was intrigued walking into the cinema to see this this week. So to me, the big question is, does this film change Villeneuve as a filmmaker? into something more substantial. What do you think?
I do, because I think this is easily his best film, and I think this film is fucking remarkable in certain respects.
Yep.
And those certain respects are, well, they're tied to the same thing. It's all about technique and craft. But I think visually, sonically, thematically, he manages to get the texture of the original right. This film feels just like Blade Runner. It feels like Ridley Scott has essentially directed his own sequel.
Yep.
On its own merits, I think, I mean, just look at the shot behind us.
Yep.
This film is visually and orally spectacular. It is just unbelievably astonishing, and a lot of that has to do with Roger Deakins, and a lot of that has to do with their VFX crew. Because it is so, the CGI for once is sublime, it's never intrusive, it's never obvious. I mean, it looks amazing. Once again, I think the story is difficult because I think the storytelling is challenging. I ended the film confused, and we'll talk a lot about that later. But I think as a trippy visual experience, it's astonishing.
See, I agree with that, but to me personally, if you want an answer to the question of is this a more complete film that kind of transcends his problems as a filmmaker, I'm not sure that it does personally, and I completely agree with you. It's another Denis Villeneuve technical tour de force as a piece of cinema, and this is absolutely a film to see and experience on the big screen.
Oh yeah,
and I really enjoyed it. But you know, you talk about the fidelity of this to the original Ridley Scott Blade Runner, and that is sort of my problem with this film. This is to me very much a Blade Runner for 2017 audiences. In that, and I think people kind of forget sometimes the kind of film that Blade Runner was. It's not an easy film. It's a very elliptical, slow-paced film with a lot of very longing glances of Harrison Ford into Sean Young's eyes and Rutger Hauer. It's not an action film by any stretch of the imagination,
but nor is this.
No, it's not. But
this is a very leisurely paced movie.
It is, but it has a series of really fantastic set pieces. And look, to me, this is very much Blade Runner for 2017. It's technically magnificent. It's a lot less mysterious than the initial Blade Runner, and I think it's a lot more accessible narratively than the original Blade Runner. Yeah, I found the writing in this really quite mixed a lot of the times. And I think, you know, you talk about some of the storytelling being confusing, and I agree with that. And what irked me in this film was a sort of mixture of some kind of muddled storytelling, but also some sort of spoon-feeding storytelling where the filmmakers don't quite trust the audience enough to pick up the kind of suggestion or sort of visual narrative illusion that is in the original Blade Runner. They don't trust the audience to go with that, so they hammer it home. That sort of irritated me semi-regularly during. So that's what I didn't like about it.
I'm surprised at that because I kind of felt the opposite. I felt that there was actually, I kept feeling like I wasn't getting it. I kept feeling behind, and that the story was almost, and a lot of the elements of it were almost too subtle to the point of that there was confusing and bad storytelling. I thought that it was trying so hard to be as elliptical and as quote unquote deep as the original Blade Runner that it was not spoon feeding us. And yet I do recognize now that you say this, that there were certain scenes that were sort of spoon feeding us. So spoiler alert, we are going into spoiler territory now because we are going to start discussing elements of the plot and the storyline. And if you haven't seen the film yet, you might want to pause and come back to this. So, for example, I guess that every single scene with Robin Wright's character in her office was spoon-feeding.
Absolutely.
It's like every time they needed to catch up the audience to what was going on, they're like, let's take him back to Robin Wright's office and let's just catch up the audience.
Yes, and also with the
she was Captain Exposition, basically.
And kind of co-Captain Exposition is Anna de Armas, who's great in this, who I love, who plays his...
She's my new girlfriend.
Yeah,
my virtual new girlfriend.
I didn't know her previously. I think she's fantastic in this.
I've never seen her before.
No, and it's a fascinating part of the sort of philosophical terrain of this film.
Yeah.
The replicant who has a replicant,
Yes.
effectively.
Yes.
And
she was so well introduced because first you
Yeah.
thought she was just Siri. She was just a voice, and you thought that's all she's going to be.
Yeah, it's really clever.
And then you start thinking, oh no, there's a live human being in the other room.
Yeah.
And then you find out it's kind of a weird distillation of both of those things.
Yes, and she also does feature in the world's greatest threesome sequence as well. It must be said for the record.
most original, unique threesome
That's a really
sequence.
inventive sex scene. I really enjoy that. But unfortunately, as good as she is, she also provides some sort of narrative support to the audience unnecessarily, I think. And there's one particular sequence where we'll get to the rest of the casting shortly, I guess. The Ryan Gosling character sees the carving on the tree, and it's clear from his facial expression. There's a 25-second shot of him looking at horror at this carving. Okay, this is significant.
Yeah.
He then narrates in an incident about 3 minutes later that he had a childhood toy wooden horse that had a carving on the bottom. You're like, okay, fine, I've got that. And Aramis then reminds us again that he had a carving, and don't you realize, young man, that carving is the same as the carving that you just saw? Audience, just to really, really kind of tie the loose ends together. It's just unnecessary. I can't see that in a film made in 1982 that isn't in desperate search of an audience.
Right.
This happened 5 or 6 times in a way that sort of irritated me, and I could just sort of sense the studio involvement in making sure that this is still, as ambitious a piece of cinema it is, a film that they really want to do well.
Yeah. Because the trick of that horse and that discovery was that it was wanting you, and I can see what you're saying, it was wanting you so much to make you think that he was the son of Harrison Ford's character, Deckard. That there had been this new development with these AI creatures, these replicants, that one gave birth, and that one that gave birth was Sean Young from the original, and that she and Deckard's son was Ryan Gosling.
Yep.
And you're right, because my feeling was, at that point, oh, this is weird, I'm ahead of this movie. I assume it's going to be quite a long movie. I'm surprised I've already got the quote-unquote twist. And then, of course, there's the reverse twist.
Yeah.
So I think you are right. They were so desperate for you to take on board the idea that he was that son that they did hammer that home a little bit.
Yeah, and this is a lot more plot heavy than the original Blade Runner. There's a lot of plotting in this film.
Yeah, because in Blade Runner, it's really just like, go catch these 4 replicants, and he goes out to catch them, and he kind of does, and then that's it. Except there's also the love story, and there's also whatever Edward James Olmos is doing in that film, which has always been... I've never
slightly
figured that
unclear,
out.
but fascinating. I love his character in the original Blade Runner, and I quite like his cameo in this. I do think they get bogged down, as elaborate and largely well told and engaging as the story is. There's just a lot of plotting to get to, and it does strip the film of a lot of the mystery and enigma of the original Blade Runner. And to me, the question is, I don't think we should forget that this is a sequel, right? And
very much so.
And, sequels have a problem, because sequels are films that are made that are standing on the shoulders of the conceptual work of films that already exist. So to really succeed as a piece of cinema, a sequel needs to offer something genuinely new. And especially when you're standing on the shoulders of one of the great philosophical science fiction
and most
pieces of literature, and cinema of all time. You really do have to offer something new of that terrain. I'm not sure that it really does. As technically magnificent and enjoyable an experience as it is, I didn't think about this film for another second after I left the cinema.
Right.
Well, I just think they've tried to pull off something extremely difficult in effectively reinventing and reimagining a Blade Runner for an early 21st century, 2017 audience that somehow retains all of the enigmatic, philosophical abstraction that is so adored in the original, while still delivering an international box office hit piece of cinema. And it is, like all of Villeneuve's films, it is an interesting mixture of kind of popcorn cinema and sort of serious big canvas.
See, that's where I actually disagree. I actually feel this is, I don't know what the budget is for this, but let's call it $120 million. I actually think this is a $120 million, 2 hour and 43 minute art film that's going to do huge business in its first weekend because they're promoting the hell out of it. And then I think it's really going to drop off because I think people are going to, the word of mouth to people is it's really long and it's confusing.
There are no good guys and bad guys in the original Blade Runner. There's this grey, right? There's Deckard, Harrison Ford chasing Rutger Hauer. There's the Tyrell Corporation in the background. This film has a bad guy. Jared Leto is, and we know that because Jared Leto's character has weird eyes and dresses like monkey magic and lives in this kind of brutalist, minimalist underground lair.
His design was incredible.
But I think this film clearly sets up its parameters in that Ryan Gosling is effectively our central character and our protagonist and our hero who we're supposed to sympathise with and
he's
adore.
a replicant. That's set out in the first 3 minutes of the movie.
That's exactly right. And Jared Leto's character is the evil big international industrialist who wants to do dastardly things and for replicants to take over the world and kills his own people brutally and at internal demonstrations and is hunting down our protagonist. It is a little murky. Okay, so why does he want to find the daughter?
I did not know.
Right, he's interested in that because that is the bridge and that is the future of their species. Effectively,
right. So he's been waiting for such a thing to happen, and now that it's happened, he's lost it, and he's got to find it.
That's exactly right. I think
pretty easy to find.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, correct. Yeah. This is what I mean about this film, kind of fudging the process of offering anything new and interesting ideas-wise that isn't covered better in the original Blade Runner. So we have the Robin Wright police figure whose job it is to maintain the separation and order between the existing replicants and the human species, and we have dastardly Jared Leto and his sort of industrialist enterprise trying to kind of fudge that and to evolve the replicants into something more dynamic that can take over the universe, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I don't find that interesting, and in fact, the Ana de Armas side narrative of the replicant's replicant and Ryan Gosling's very touching relationship with his own small, fry, holographic replicant, far more philosophically resonant and interesting than the bigger canvas and bigger story in play in this film.
The Ryan Gosling-Ana de Armas relationship was, for me, the most interesting element of the film too, because the moment, that whole early sequence where she's introduced, when you think she's a Siri, then you think she's a human being, then you realize she's a hologram, but then he does this thing where she's a hologram, but you can kind of touch it, and then when she does the threesome thing, like the way she's developed is fascinating, and it does bring up the questions of what would robots have robots? How would robots have relationships? Once we do give robots things approaching emotions and souls, how do we then satisfy those things? And that was all fascinating. That could have been an entire movie.
And it's dealt with very eloquently and simply. And again, I don't think it's anything that isn't in the original.
And her performance.
She's great, And there's nothing there that, again, isn't in the original Blade Runner film. And it's all about, if this is real to them, how is that not real then? Which is really kind of essentially what, arguably Blade Runner, the original, is all about. Rutger Hauer and the replicants. If they feel, why is that not real? And why is that less real than what a so-called human feels? And there's a lovely, eloquent, quite moving depiction of that between their relationship, which I found more interesting than the increasingly convoluted machinations of the larger plot in play with the conspiracy, the hidden daughter, Jared Leto trying to track them down, etc., etc.
The rebellion, the rebels, they came really late in the film, like 2 hours and 30 minutes. It was a badly directed scene. Like as the leader of the rebellion with the single eye was discussing the rebellion, the rebels sort of walked up behind her. Like it really looked like it was out of Battlestar Galactica. No offense to that show.
What it reminded me of in an unfortunate way, and this is again one of my problems with this film, all of a sudden I felt like I was in a Matrix sequel, which is not a good thing.
Me too.
If you ask me.
Too.
And
straight down to her makeup. She
absolutely.
Looked like,
all of these sort of quickly assembled extras with dreadlocks that appear on shot, and you have no idea where they've come from. You've had no allusion to them existing.
And not only that, I felt like I was in the setup for another film.
Yes.
I really felt, that's when I felt what you're talking about like, the money side, the economics. I felt that scene was like setting up Blade Runner 2056.
Yeah, and it's clunky and it's not well executed.
Yeah. Because it takes more than 2 hours before Harrison Ford shows up.
Yes.
I guess by the time he showed up, I was like, we don't need you.
Yeah.
And because he's such a familiar face, and because after about 6 minutes of Harrison Ford, he says a Harrison Ford witticism about the dog, and for the first time in the whole movie, the audience laughs.
Yeah.
And Harrison Ford sort of brought the funny. I felt like I was in a different movie all of a sudden.
Yeah, I agree. And I
don't think the movie needed Harrison.
I completely agree, actually, and he really doesn't have much to do in this film at all.
He spends most of it manacled.
You get the feeling he sort of turned up on set and shot his scenes in an afternoon. And, you know, Harrison Ford is one of the great charismatic presences in cinema over the last 40 years. And he does that, and he's charismatic as he always is, and he has very, very little to do other than to say a couple of witty things and kind of chase about with Ryan Gosling for about 35 minutes.
Yeah. I didn't think he was necessary at all. And indeed, he made the plot more confusing.
Yes.
Because then when he ends up with Jared Leto, like, explain to me, just explain to me what it was about when Sean Young comes back and then he says her eyes are a different color and then Jared Leto shoots her in the head.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Yeah, I have no idea, and it's a really confusing sequence, and you're really unclear of what the intended outcome of the characters is in this scene.
Yeah.
Why did Jared Leto go to all this effort to bring in a recreated Sean Young? Why do they need to impress Harrison Ford?
Yeah.
You know? And they've already alluded to the fact that they can torture the crap out of him.
Silver Hayek or whatever her name is, Silver Heck.
Yeah.
You know, his henchwoman.
Yeah.
Why didn't she kill Ryan Gosling?
This is very unclear. Yeah, why do they leave him for the Matrix sequel? Postmodern industrialist, extra rebellion people to come and pick him up. No idea. Unclear. It does get increasingly unclear. Okay, so look, we've talked about the bad. There's lots of good in this film as well, and this is absolutely, I think, a film to see and experience on the big film, like all of Denis Villeneuve's films.
The cinematography, to me, is the number one thing about it that was good. I think Roger Deakins is finally going to get his Oscar for this.
Yep.
I thought the cinematography was magnificent.
Yep.
And like just from the opening, like it's so surprising. Like if you remember the opening, I guess he's in his little space car or whatever.
Yeah.
And but before you see that, you just see this flying shot over this landscape that's kind of white, and you can't even tell exactly why.
Are you talking about the opening sequence?
Yeah.
Right, over the farming
Yes, over the farming.
Yeah.
Over the farm world or whatever, the acres and acres of farmland, what it is for them.
Yeah.
And that just opening shot was so Kubrickian, so astonishing. And I was just like, holy shit, this is amazing.
Yeah, and I love the smallness. I do like some of the things that they've very self-consciously retained from the original film, and you know, one of those elements, and you know, this is co-written by the original screenwriter,
Hampton Fancher.
Hampton Fancher, yes,
He's
correct.
a wacky man with a wacky name.
He is. It's a great documentary about him that came out last
Hampton
year.
Fancher.
What a name that is! Yeah. But and I do like the way that he retains this sort of kind of postmodern gumshoe approach to the narrative, and it starts with this small incident.
And with a guy who uses a kettle.
Exactly,
I mean, it's real cyberpunk.
That reveals a much bigger conspiracy, and the protagonist slowly pulls that thread.
Dave Bautista, very good in that scene.
He's great, isn't he? Yeah, from the Guardians of the Galaxy films that people may know.
And before that, I guess he was wrestler.
Yes. I really loved the opening 20 minutes of it a lot, and the smallness of the initial.
And it was
setup.
very, very evocative of the original.
Yes, absolutely correct. Yeah, but and I think, you know, people use this term a lot when they're describing contemporary films. That, but this really, really is a technical marvel.
Yeah.
And in a way that I'm not sure has ever been done before. I think the synergy of, you know, to quote David Bowie, the sound and vision in this film is really, really
the soundtrack
something else.
Is freaking great, isn't it?
Look, it is and it isn't. I really like the Hans Zimmer score a lot. I like the way it references the analog synth original Vangelis score.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit disappointed that we didn't get to hear Johan Johansson's score for this, who is Denis Villeneuve's usual composer pal, who he kind of turfed really late on, apparently. Who originally wrote and scored the film.
Right.
And I like the score. I kind of get the feeling he settled for something again much more homage-based and conservative in its referencing and reproduction of the Vangelis score.
I mean,
than
it
what
sounds like you could have
Johansson would
made
done.
it in 1982.
It does,
It's got, I mean, I don't know music like you do, but I can tell a synth.
Yes.
I can tell an old school synth.
Yeah, it's full. It's a score that's essentially based around kind of analog classical synths from the
original
late
Vangelis
70s
score.
and early 80s. Yep, with some brass and additional stuff, and it's very much along those lines. And it's huge and it sounds great.
Yeah.
But again, it's not anything that it's the original score just on steroids. I mean, I do love the sequence where we're reintroduced to Deckard in the Vegas casino with the sort of faltering reproductions of an Elvis concert going on in the background.
That
as
was
they
really
punch
clever.
the crap out of each other. That's a stunning sequence.
Yeah.
That's really fun and
And
imaginative.
then the hologram of Frank Sinatra. And I
Yes.
was thinking, of course, being who I am, I wonder how much they paid, the Sinatra estate and the Elvis estate. And then at the end, it turns out those were all actors.
You're kidding.
That wasn't
really?
Sinatra, that wasn't
Whoa,
Elvis. No,
God.
the credits, Elvis double, Sinatra double.
Wow, walking down.
And then there were thanks to the estates of those gentlemen, but they weren't those gentlemen.
And I've never
Marilyn
seen,
too.
inclusive of the recent Planet of the Apes and Star Wars films, I've never seen CGI rendering look this good.
Yeah, the
as it
CGI was
does in this
incredible.
film. Ultimately, I enjoyed this.
Good.
It in no way shifted what I think of Villeneuve as a filmmaker.
I think
And-
he's slightly better now to me.
Okay, all right. And ultimately, I don't think this does anything that the original Blade Runner doesn't do better. The technical
No,
achievement
yeah,
of this
no.
notwithstanding.
But when does a sequel? I mean, when does a sequel do the original better? That doesn't happen.
What's the point then?
A sequel by its then you're asking that's time for another thing, because then you're saying
Sure.
why sequel?
Well,
You
it's a really good question. And that's my point about box office and the way that I think they have attempted
I don't
to
think
make
this film was made to make money.
I do. I really think they have attempted to make a 2017 Blade Runner that works both as a philosophical treatise in a similar way to the original Blade Runner and a piece of popcorn entertainment. And I don't think you can pull off them both together.
I suspect that this film is going to do, as I said, tremendous opening weekend and then fall away.
Right.
I think it'll ultimately be we only just made it in
Yeah.
terms of paying back its
Very
budget plus
significant
marketing.
bills.
It's very
Yep.
significant bills.
Yep.
I think the reason it exists is not because they thought it was a surefire money winner.
Yep.
I think the reason it exists is because Ridley Scott wanted to do it and is 80 and has made all the right phone calls.
Yeah. Well, look,
I
if
think
Ridley-
I think it's the reason it exists is because he wants it to exist.
Well, and because it's one of the most loved films and one of the all-time, cult films in cinema history.
Do you think it's going to do very well, or do you think?
I think it'll do pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Ryan Gosling, Harrison Ford, one of the all-time great cult
Yeah.
sance fiction films.
They're
I think
on the-
it'll
they're on
do
the Global
fine.
Dog and Pony
What
Show.
did
The
you?
reviews have been very good
They
so
have.
far.
Yeah. What did you think of Mr. Gosling?
I think he was great. I think
I liked
absolutely.
him
I think
too.
he was perfect casting.
Yeah, I
because Ryan Gosling is best when he's like this.
Yeah.
And he's a replicant.
Yeah.
And they tell you he's a replicant in the first 3 minutes,
Yeah.
and so he plays replicant really well.
Yeah.
I think all of the
And he has
casting
those
in this
doe
film.
eyes that he carries about with him for the entire film, and
I think all of the casting in this film is spot on. Even
Yeah, I agree.
I think those two women that we've talked about at length are terrific, and they're sort of essentially. I mean, they've both done other work, but they're essentially unknowns to the kind of audience this film's going for.
Yeah.
I think even though Robin Wright's character is the worst written, I think she's appropriate in the role.
Right.
I think she's okay in the role.
Yeah.
Jared Leto.
Jared Leto is to me the one big dud in
His
this.
character is stupid.
It has nothing
as,
to do.
as written, but I still think he does it well.
Yeah,
I think he looks good.
Yeah, sure. He looks great.
Robin Wright, her death scene is fantastic.
It is,
That is
yeah.
great direction. I loved her death scene because Sylvia Heck goes to stab her and she puts the blade in
Yeah.
and it's shocking,
Yeah.
but then we cut to outside, if you remember that moment. And and the music stops
Yeah.
and the sound stops and we just hear the sound of rain and we just see it through the window. And I thought, okay, you
Yeah.
are a director.
Yeah.
That is
Oh,
an
look.
amazing cut. I had one other thing I realized that I wanted to talk to you about
Yeah.
that I think is very cool. What they've done is, as far as I can tell, they've taken 1982's vision of whenever Blade Runner is meant to be set, like 2019.
2019, yep.
And they followed the tech on along that alternate reality line.
Yes.
And therefore, in this film, you do not have mobile phones.
Yes.
And you do not have Facebook. And you do not have a lot of the things that we have.
Yes.
Because they've taken the future based on Blade Runner's vision of the future and gone down that road. They have not gone down like 2049 as down our road.
Yeah,
they've gone down that road.
And there are some other
nice... There are no mobile phones.
And there are other nice touches as well. Previously, the sort of girly three-dimensional dimensions are now much more hardcore in the kind of public space. Yeah, I agree. And that's very consistently done. That's a
cool.
nice detail. Yeah, look, he's all across the technical details of this very fleshed-out world that he's continued. I don't think there's any issue there. I think that, as we talked about, the issues of this film are elsewhere.
Final thoughts or interesting things?
No, look,
Did you want it to be shorter?
No, I didn't have a problem with its length at all. I was never bored.
No, I was never bored. I was entranced.
No, I was never bored. I enjoyed all of it. I stand by what I said at the beginning, that this hasn't shifted what I think of Villeneuve as a filmmaker at all, and that I really do think they fudge attempting to kind of meld what was originally a sort of smallish, abstract, philosophical science fiction film from the early 80s with a big budget, high concept popcorn film, and it just doesn't quite come off to me.
I think it's whatever. Let's say it's $150 million. I say it's a $150 million art house film with surprising resonance that I think will actually not prove to be a big mainstream success. I think it's going to win some Oscars, though.
Yeah.
Besides cinematography, it might do the Mad Max Fury Road sweep. It might, get production design, costume design,
awards.
or sound design, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Design awards and technique, visual effects. It has to.
Yes, absolutely. And look, and I think this
we've got the apes. We've got a lot this year. Visual effects.
Yeah. But I mean, that's sort of what I mean about yes, this is a technical marvel, but it seemingly every second film with a budget of in excess of 100 million is a technical marvel now. We do need, and especially a film that does take itself very seriously as this does. Yes, it's still seeking a large audience, but this is a very self-important film in a lot of ways.
As the first one was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the technical magnificence of it isn't enough, I think, where it doesn't fundamentally offer anything that wasn't covered more dynamically in the original.
I can agree with that. You've been watching Watch This. Jim and I have been discussing Blade Runner 2049 in depth in our spoiler alert episode. Blade Runner 2049 is appearing in cinemas and on bus stops around the world right now.
They know you're here.
I always told you, you're special.